Thank you so much for joining us here tonight to stop, to put your devices on mute, and to take the time to pay your respects to honor this man, Howard Brandston. To be here in this moment to support Howard's family and to perhaps learn about his legacy for the first time if you're a student, or to enjoy the memory of your own time with Howard as you've been doing upstairs at the reception and earlier as you came in tonight. I've heard some really remarkable stories already. The IES NYC History Committee has devoted dozens of hours to culling through their archives to present tonight's program. Dan Blitzer will introduce that in a moment, but right now I'd like to acknowledge Howard's family who is here tonight at just one of the several tributes the industry has planned to celebrate Howard Brandston. It was not only Howard who gave us his time, it was also his family. I'm sure any of them would enjoy speaking with you afterwards, so don't hesitate to seek them out at the closing reception. You know, sharing stories is catharsis, it's respectful, and it's helpful to the family. I imagine they would find comfort in the conversation and in the remembrance. So I think I have all the family members. We have Melanie Brandston, his wife, who's down here in the front, Lori Brandston, his daughter. We have Julia Levy, granddaughter, Eli Levy and family, Perry Brandston, and Melody Brandston, and then perhaps Raj Brandston. So thank you all. We are honored to have worked with your father, your grandfather, your friend, your husband. Now I'd like to introduce Dan Blitzer so we can go to the most important part of the program, the memories, the interviews. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Wow. Tonight, you'll mostly hear from Howard in his own words, as he sat for a variety of interviews with the TALK, the Talk Committee, and others. Credit for the hard work of piecing together these clips belongs primarily to Shay Mosen, Bob Prowse, David Munson, David DeLaura, Addison Kelly, and Bill Mayman. Personal aside, I met Howard for the first time about 40 years ago, but of course I knew of him well before that. It's hard to imagine somebody in lighting at that time who didn't know of Howard. His soft voice disguised a remarkably deep and at times hard-edged intellect. It was a challenge just to keep up with him. Over time, Howard appeared less intimidating and irascible than indomitable, especially in pursuit of creative vision. Over the course of his career, Howard, along with many others, helped shape much of what we take for granted today about lighting: the rise of lighting design, the importance of design in the Illuminating Engineering Society, the rigor of lighting standards, and the connection of energy codes to lighting requirements. In tonight's video, you'll certainly see this Howard, but there are many others here as well. One challenge was finding Howard discussing the character of his many, many projects. Bob Prowse has filled in with comments on just a few of the examples. In the video, Howard refers to his book, Learning to See, A Matter of Light. It's small format, but very powerful, and available from the IES. One of many characteristic statements in the book is this: the greatest contribution a person can offer himself or his circle of friends is creativity and originality, even though this may entail a departure from conventional wisdom. I think that reflects Howard as much as any one of the many brilliant statements here. At the close of the video, Brooke Silber, one of Howard's students at the Lighting Research Center, will share some thoughts of Howard as a teacher and mentor. Afterwards, as we all mingle, there'll be plenty of opportunity to talk and ask questions. With that, let's watch.
My name is Howard Brandston. I'm a lighting designer. I've just written a book. It's called Learning to See, A Matter of Light. It's a book for everybody because as well as we can see, there's still a lot to learn. And most learning takes place through your eyes. So you might as well find out how your eye works to engage your brain for knowledge. Now, almost none of you will know me because what I do, lighting design, is not something that attracts attention. However, you will all know some of the work I've done, like the lighting for the Statue of Liberty. Also, the lighting for the Petronas Towers, the world's largest towers in Malaysia. I also did the master plan for the lighting of Battery Park City, the Central Business District of Detroit, and several other projects like that. So there's a lot of people who are wandering around in the light that I've cast around their environments. What is a designer? Okay. I don't know because there's so many different designers, and I guess each one is as individual, following whatever they believe is the best method for them to work. I was fortunate in having an incredibly rich education. It was like I was born with a platinum spoon in my mouth. I started out in art very, very young. And when I went to high school, I had one of the country's foremost art teachers in a special program at Lincoln High School. His name was Leon Friend, a very gifted man, and I was on the art squad, which was a privilege beyond belief. There was even a retrospective of Leon Friend and his art squad members at the Museum of Modern Art years ago. Also at that same school was a teacher of theater named Gustav Blum. Gustav Blum was the head of the WPA program for the restoration of the theater. And it's hard to imagine the influence of those two very special gentlemen on a very young man, and the introduction to both theater and art by two of the better people in America. I went to the Irwin Piscator Theater in the 40s and saw remarkable productions of Shakespeare, experimental theater, and learned to draw, learned to speak, learned to think, learned to bring some spiritual quality to the creation of any work. I was told that a blank piece of paper was an opportunity for a work of art. And I was to fill that paper. And I was to treat that piece of paper as that opportunity. I went to Brooklyn College. And because of the influence of my parents, it was really clear that I had to be a doctor, a lawyer, or at least a CPA. Very, very soon, I was up to my nose in formaldehyde or whatever else was in that, and I didn't like the prescribed math, and I didn't like the prescribed this or that, and I needed something to do that would keep my art and theater influence alive. So I noticed one day on the board there were tryouts for the varsity players. I thought, oh boy, this is hot stuff. I'll go and try out for the play. I was a great actor in high school. I should do well here. I didn't quite understand that there's a difference in level of sophistication between the people who were in college with me, even the entering freshmen, and me, because I was 16 years old at the time. And I was so intimidated by the tryouts that I didn't even get up and say a word when I saw how good these students were. So I went away and moped. A short time after that, the varsity players had an announcement that they were producing a play and they needed help. I guess the play was cast and now there were other things to do, which I knew about, so I figured I'd show up and see what was happening. And I was listening to this process unfold and watching all these very elegant, sophisticated older folks than me, at least in their 20s, do this stuff. And I said, well, they were coming down near the end of the list and somebody said, we need somebody to work on the lighting. I said, this is my last chance. I'll do that. So I raised my hand. I was the only one. They said, okay, you, come up here. And so I did. And it was startling to me because it was something I had thought about, in high school and had done a little with it, but nothing I ever was deeply involved in. And there I was, working on the lighting with a really very, very smart designer, who knew all this stuff. And I learned about Stanley McCandless and all these people for the real thing. I quick got a book and read it, and began to do some other stuff to bone up on this thing that I volunteered to do. I needed to know things like electricity. So I wouldn't electrocute myself because I had to wires and drag things here and there and hang instruments and focus them and see how they all work. And I got all of that, and I learned that very fast and worked on it very furiously. And on the next show, I had done so well that they let me do it. Now, the remarkable thing was I didn't know anything really. And that lack of knowledge, or that wonderful naivete, allowed me to think about how I wished every scene to look. I could recite every word of that play. I knew where every actor stood, and I composed what I wished each word to look like. So it was not just the sequence of words. It was as if I was trying to turn those words into a visual image that reinforced whatever that was. It was a forever process. And it turned out to be fairly well received. Then they said that I could light one of these little, this was in the main theater of the school, which was a tiny theater, about a 300-seater. But they were in the process of building this enormous theater complex with a 1,500-seat auditorium, a 500-seat theater, and a big 3,000-seat amphitheater. This was in process, and it was going to have all the latest stuff. So this became extremely exciting to me. It would be one of 3 major theaters in the university system in the country at the time. And I was going to do this little theater program, and in an experimental theater. And I thought about it and thought about what I had to do, and it was really clear that you couldn't do good lighting in that theater. There was not enough power to hook up enough lights, and there was not enough control that good lighting could be done. But I was not shy, even though I was, probably just going on 17, and thought, well, that could be solved. And we have lots of cable in the main theater, and we're not using the main theater during the experimental season. I would just run cable through the air conditioning, through the ventilation ducts down from the main theater to the little theater, and I'd use the main theater board. One of the theater aficionados of the school was a man named Jim Peterson. and he was the superintendent of buildings and grounds. And he came to the play, as I found out he came to every play after this one. And at the end of the show, he called me over and he said, "You know, that's the best lighting I've ever seen done in the little theater. And he said, and I finally figured out how you did it. And if you don't remove all of that stuff at once, I'm going to have you thrown out of school." "And you got to promise me you will never do that again." Well, he was terrifying. This guy was 6'4", a big Norwegian guy. And man, then he called me over and said, "You're very industrious and everything you did was safe. It's just, we don't do that here." He said, "But we're building a new theater," which of course I knew. He said, "I need somebody like you to work in that. How would you like a job as a member of the staff of Buildings and Grounds to take care of that thing?" And by that time I had really studied up on George Eisenhower and Stanley McCandless, Thyrotron tube dimmers, everything else. I now knew somewhat a little more than electricity.
What year was that?
1953. I went and watched them put that theater together and made sure that all the components were going in right, and it was really a remarkable bit of architectural education, and working with one of the more illustrative architects of our time, Serge Chermayeff of the famous Cambridge 7. He was the father of Ivan Chermayeff and Peter Chermayeff, and Serge Chermayeff was the architect of this building, which some of the faculty called Chermayeff's Revenge. But for me, it was a gift of the greatest toy anyone could have, because it was so superbly equipped that there was probably nothing you couldn't do. The Broadway shows did not have this kind of control equipment. They were still using resistance dimmer boards and small preset boards, and the big theaters had auto transformer dimmers. Only Radio City Music Hall had one of these gadgets.
Mm-hmm. And this gadget was?
The big Thyrotron tube Eisenhower multi-scene preset board. And the other one was a big Ward Leonard magnetic amplifier board. And so I was there putting in all the new stuff and being given a modicum of control with my job in the Department of Buildings and Grounds. And it was fascinating. You know, by then I was beginning to learn some of the protocols of lighting. One of the great things about being at Brooklyn College at the time was that, again, it was amazing good fortune that a man named Vance Morton was the head of the theater department. And Vance Morton was one of the most distinguished directors in educational theater. And he came to Brooklyn College because of this new theater and brought with him a whole gifted design team. And so again, I was just another ramp up on the chance to do all this stuff.
Do you remember the instruments that you had to work with?
It was all the standard theater equipment. There were, piles of Fresnels of every size, piles of beam projectors, scoops, floods, border lights, ellipsoidal reflector spotlights of every size imaginable, and hundreds upon hundreds of them, because there were 3 theaters. So you didn't have to leave them in the theaters. You could do whatever you wished to do. You could just borrow from Peter to pay Paul, as long as the shows were okay and the touring companies that came through were serviced well. And here I was, just a kid doing that. They came to me at the end of we still hadn't moved into the theater, and it was felt very strongly that they needed to get somebody to be a teaching assistant, because with this new place, they would need an enlarged staff. The faculty felt that that would be a good idea. And so I thought, wow, I'm going to have somebody else coming here. He'll come from Yale or Iowa or one of the Northwestern University, and I was beginning to know all the folks who were something else, you know, all the guys who were considered special. And even though I hadn't met them, I certainly knew where to find out about them and read their books and all of the things that they did. And there was something in me, and I think it was probably Gustav Bloom and Erwin Piscator and Leon Friend, who said, you know, that's the way they do it. That's what made them special. What should I do? So I thought, oh, well, I've got to do something here. And
So did you go from student to full-time employee?
no, I was still a student. Still a student.
Okay.
They gave me, as a student, they gave me a graduate teaching assistantship, and they allowed me to do a certain amount of design and supervision through my job as a member of the staff of Buildings and Grounds. And I needed that job because my parents were paupers. I mean, took all they could do to buy me a $17 bicycle. The thing that was so great about that is that when the theater was finished, that I could live rent-free because I moved a hammock into the sub-basement of the theater until they found me and kicked me out of there. And then I had to pay rent again. Because of this was such a huge order, Century Lighting got the order, you know, I went I met the famous Stanley McCandless, and I met, you know, I met the famous Rollo Gillespie Williams and some other luminaries of the lighting world, the famous Edward F. Cook, who was the owner of Century Lighting. And I was doing this amazing production. I can't remember the name of it, unfortunately. But I felt that there was a special effect that needed to be done, and I rented 100 more beam projectors. This was for about a 4-minute effect, and I invited Stanley McCandless to the show. When he heard that I had rented, because one of the guys, the electricians from the rental division, told him that I had rented 100 of these things, he came to see it. That's got me, when I graduated, that was one of two things that got me the job. The second one, we did a show called Peer Gynt. And I was one of the designers for the show and wanted to do the entire set with very allegorical scenery. And I was going to do projections. And I was looking at Wilfrid projectors and all the famous scene projectors of the time. And there were none that would fill a 36-foot high, 97-foot around cyclorama. I said, well, that's not a problem. I will design special Linnebach projectors that will fill that screen. And again, this time a whole pile of people came to see that show. Some guys from Broadway here and there showed up, and they looked at this stuff. And the minute I graduated, I got this job to be Stanley McCandless's assistant. And then I went to work for Stanley McCandless.
Well, after reading his books for all those years, what was he really like?
Oh, Stanley McCandless was a very, very courtly gentleman, very distinguished, elegant person. He always wore a 3-piece suit, always wore a hat, a skimmer in the summer. You never...
What's a skimmer?
You know, one of those straw hats that they wear at Oxford.
Yeah.
and I would sit there, and he would take me around, you know, as his assistant, and I met all kinds of famous people. I met Frank Lloyd Wright, Eero Saarinen, Kevin Roach, you know, just a who's who, just by being on his coattails. And he would always introduce me as, here's the spoiled brat of the lighting industry.
It was the most wonderful thing. The theater was total freedom. You had no codes, no standards, know anything. The only thing you had to worry about was the job you were doing to enhance this production going to be good. There was nothing there. So when I got into working with Stanley McCandless and switching over to architectural lighting, I figured out that all these rules were a substitute for thinking. And so I did whatever I wanted. So I went right back to my basic upbringing of lighting shows.
But he drove me equally crazy, not because he was intending to, because he spoke about things that I knew nothing about. Of course, I would never admit it, but I'd immediately write it down and go and find out.
Can you give us an example?
The only example that really is clear to me, Warren Plattner, who was one of Vero Sarnen's partners, came in one day and we were discussing a job, and McCandless was telling him all about how this would work and that would work, and I'm sitting there goggle-eyed listening to all of this. And finally, Warren knew that I had to do all the work because that's the way things were. They still are today. There's the studio master and then somebody does it. He looked at me and said, "Do you understand that?" I said, "Sure." He said, "Well, come outside and explain it to me." I went outside and I said, "The way things work around here, he says them, I write them down, I look them up and find out, and then I'll let you know." And there were all kinds of great researchers and papers being given, and Rollo Williams was going, who was another one of the people who worked there, was going to be the president of the New York section of the Illuminating Engineering Society in 1959, and those guys, and probably one of the most important guys in lighting who's unknown is Sonny Sonnenfeld. Those two guys talked me into joining the Illuminating Engineering Society in 1959 and to be active, not just to be a member.
You are known both as an icon and an iconoclast. How can that be? Tell us about this.
That's true. And I guess the icon is something that I earned. The iconoclast is something that I was taught as a young man, to be straightforward, to be honest, and to only say the truth. And always be polite. My parents were very strict about that. So whenever things came up that got my attention, I would say exactly what I thought about them. That always wasn't well received, but it did have some impact.
Talk about some of those.
I would go along and write all these things. And one day, a couple of guys from the Illuminating Engineering Society came into my office and said, "Howard, you're always critical of this and that. You have suggestions about all kinds of things, but you're not an active member." I said, "Well, I don't always agree with all the things that you guys do, so I just mention things as I see them and let it go." He said, "Well, we don't like that. We want you to come and be somebody here. We will publish anything you have to say. We'll put your name on the masthead of the magazine, so there's a contributing editor and all that. It's fine." So I thought, well, I grew up in the theater. So the first article I'll write for LDNA was the benefits of growing up in the theater. And I published that, and it was very nice. I was thrilled. The energy crisis hit. And I was having disagreements with the standards committees about the recommended practices. So I thought, oh, here's a chance that I can put this in print. I'm a contributing editor to the magazine. So I wrote an article, this was 1975, called "A Little Light on Sight," which was simultaneously published, because I wrote it as a scientific paper, by the National Society for the Prevention of Blindness. The two of the magazines came out together. And when the society read the magazine, they thought that having somebody write articles like that might not be such a good idea. So they had my name removed from the magazine, and they had me barred from all committee memberships. That had no impact on me, because if there was something that needed to be addressed, there's something in me that said I could still be the voice. Now, the editor at that time was Charles Beersley, and he published everything. All the negative letters were in there month after month. One time, he put a heading across the whole page. Good grief, it's Howard Brandston. And that was a sort of an incentive to, if there was going to be a gap closed between the art and science of illumination, I could be a little bit of that voice. So I took that as a challenge to pay attention, to look, to be more attentive to what the IES was doing. And Kurt Frank became president, and he got the ban lifted. So, I suddenly was accepted, or more accepted again. But there was never a hard feeling.
Howard became IES president in 1983, and he was instrumental in cementing the ties between the IES and ANSI, the American National Standards Institute. To become a member of ANSI's process, the IES committees had to be more openly structured, more equally balanced in membership, and their recommendations subjected to peer and public review. I had always considered this effort to be Howard's greatest effect on the Illuminating Engineering Society.
I'm most famous for standing up for what I believe the lighting profession should be able to accomplish. I have been very proactive in creating standards, making sure that these standards will serve the general public, and to defend against legislation that I think would be a detriment to the practice. I think I'm fairly well known for that. And that goes beyond my recognition as a designer. So I have 105 design awards, but who knows about that? Who cares about that? That hasn't made a contribution to anything other than those projects. I'm here today to ask that you revisit a portion of the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 that provides for a de facto ban on traditional incandescent light bulbs. I firmly believe that the restrictions put on incandescent lamps will have a significant negative impact on almost every residence in our country. I believe how one lives in their home is a decision that rests with the occupant and is not the purview of the government. I believe this violates the very principles upon which this nation was founded, and I, as a devoted citizen, am most proud of our freedom of our choice in our personal lives. What disturbs me even more, that the restrictions placed on incandescent lamps will not save enough energy to be worth the expense and the risks that every person in America will be subjected to. Some of the most knowledgeable people I know have begun to stockpile a lifetime supply of incandescent lamps to protect themselves from the need to use compact fluorescent lamps. The public at large does not understand these problems as these professionals do. And further, the misleading claims made about the benefits of the lamp technologies that are touted as beneficial replacements seduce people to purchase these products. We have over 100 years' experience using incandescent lamps. By comparison, we have very little experience using the new light sources, especially in residences. You will hear a wide range of statistical data of energy saved in comparative terms, that give the illusion of saving energy in the environment. The plain truth is, according to the Energy Information Administration, only 3.6% of total energy is consumed by incandescent lamps. So you will save some portion of that minuscule number. But I ask, when you enter everyone's home and subject them and their families to the list of potential consequences that I will list, is that worth it? I do not believe it is.
If somebody said it was white, I would say it was black. It was clear to me that if the quality of the thought was measured by the ferocity of the argument you could generate over it. And some guys around the IES and the ILD understand that very clearly. You know, they have been in wicked debates with me when I didn't agree. But all of those guys have changed their minds. And there's lots of things that are no more that were in the handbook that have vanished because of that simple philosophy. But that's where it came from. I mean, it really came from this very rich education I had, you know, at that time. It was right at the end of the WPA program, and I was right there, sopping up all this stuff like a sponge and getting the opportunities to try it out. And Sonny Sonnenfeld was very, very supportive. I mean, I owe an awful lot to Sonny Sonnenfeld, because McCandless would always be worrying about how much money some of these designs would cost. And Sonny was thinking, boy, if they buy these designs, look at the sales we're going to make. Well, being brought up by Stanley McCandless, you have a certain handicap, because lighting designers or professionals did not solicit business. So when I decided to start my own office, I sent out announcements to everyone that I was now in private practice.
So your private practice started right after?
It started in 1965. I decided, you know, I was at Seymour Evans Associates. We didn't get along. I learned everything not to do. I had a chance to work on wonderful projects with Seymour and turn out some really beautiful things and some things that functioned, you know, depending on what it was. But it was a good experience, and it was a good business experience too. You know, as I said, I learned everything not to do.
Well, was Seymour a businessman?
No. Seymour was raconteur, man about town, playboy, and wonderful creative salesman. He could sell you the moon several times.
Okay. So Howard now has his business.
Yes. So
Tell us about your early...
I sent out all these announcements.
Okay.
That was really quite fun, you know, and it gave me, you know, I got this tiny office in the flower district in New York, above a flower shop, little walk up, and I had a very, very famous graphic designer who did packaging for Procter & Gamble and all of this and that, you know, major corporations.
What was that?
His name was,
Okay.
coming back, you know, some of these names are vanishing. This is a good exercise for me to try and think of some of these names. And I remember it was Ken. And Ken was a good designer. I mean, he was a world-class designer, and I picked him to do the graphics. And he did that for me as a pro bono gift to me to help my practice go, you know, get started. I could not afford to have hired him. So I had this very fancy stationery, you know, and sent this all out.
This was this infinitely small text on the business cards?
Yeah, you know, just really beautiful stuff. And and it went out.
What year? 65?
65.
Okay.
It was officially incorporated in 66. My family friend lawyer made me make it legal, you know, but I started out in 65, and it was a good opportunity for me to, you know, think about my music, because that's all there was to do, was to play the guitar and think about musical composition or writing because I was waiting, since you weren't supposed to ask for a job. Nothing as denigrating or as low class as that. And I was telling a couple of my friends, that I was like going to go down the tube, from formerly being a fairly, substantially paid person as an associate and Seymour Evans associate, I was now making zero. I had to decide whether I could have a hot dog or a hamburger for lunch.
Battery Park City was built on top of the old piers and landfill from the excavation for the World Trade Center. The idea was to create an atmosphere reminiscent of an older New York. We worked with Gerald Allen and Associates to develop a post-lantern design. The main rule the city gave us was that we had to use the same polycarbonate diffuser that they used everywhere. This detailing was specific to Battery Park City, and Allen's office went on to design one for Central Park and 2 others. The Battery Park design was very reminiscent of an earlier pole in the city's inventory. Our office was in charge of the optics, which moved the lamp higher up into the cap of the fixture, making it a more or less sharp cutoff fixture. The optional upward component was never utilized. We also used the Bishopscrook pole that we had revived for the Helmsley Palace Hotel before the city discovered their old tooling in a storage yard in Queens. There were also several areas where specific designs were developed in ways unlike the typical areas to provide a variety of visual experience. Environmental artist Mary Miss, architect Stan Eckstedt, and landscape architect Susan Child designed South Cove as a quieter, more natural element within the city fabric, and we provided the lighting design of blue lights reflecting off the water at the water's edge and the post lantern elsewhere.
We're looking at a lobbyless lobby. You entered this park that happened to be there. There were flamboyant banners and scaffolding. There was a number of artists brought in to create special things. There was a gigantic fishing lure hung under the building, a pond below, a wonderful sculpture of a telephone booth by Forrest Wilson, and a couple of other muralists did a mermaid mural. Pamela Waters did like Alice in Wonderland chess pieces that were out there. Rudy designed some strange chairs, and I put this neon tunnel as an entrance into the building with light bulbs as graphics to tell you the floors, and pin spots of light that you had to walk through like sunshine through a forest, except in a very disciplined pattern. That were like laser beams of light that you had to pass through.
The Denver 16th Street Transitway Mall was conceived to bring life to a struggling downtown, and has turned out to be wildly successful. The basic form of the light pole was developed by Howard and Harry Cobb on airplane napkins. The idea of 3 slender poles rather than one larger one, and the floating lighting element within a clear globe is unique. Mock-ups played a key role. The Office of I. Pei and Partners, as it was then known, had a fabulous model shop. We arranged for the late Sterner lighting to provide the reflector and lamp holder elements, and Pei's shop built the rest. To test it, the forecourt of the Metropolitan Museum of Art was selected because it had stone paving and trees in scale with those proposed for the Denver site. Plus, we knew the lighting director of the Met at the time and were able to arrange for an extension cord. Here's Inspector Gadget in his trench coat explaining something or other to Harry Cobb with Howard and one of the architects. After we learned what we could from that exercise, the CDs called for the manufacturer, after shop drawing submittal and approval, to tool up and produce 4 units and set them up at the specified spacing somewhere outdoors. It turned out to be the Guardco parking lot in California. We were able to refine some detailing without requiring replacing any of the already approved tooling. Here is a short video of the somewhat recent revamping of the fixtures for LEDs.
One that everybody knows, of course, is the Statue of Liberty. You know, that is, you know, how do you get a job like that? I mean, again, it falls in, you know, the basic thing. If somebody wants you to do this job, they will call you. I got this phone call. Said, hey, Howard, how would you like to light the Statue of Liberty? I said, of course I would, you know.
Who was the call from?
Richard Hayden, who was the architect for the Statue of Liberty. We were working for, eventually I was hired and worked for the French-American Committee, who hired the team to do that. And it took a little while for me to understand what a significant commission this was, you know. And they were trying to tell me that, you know, my friends, saying, you know, guys would give their eye teeth for this project. They'd say, yeah, I know, you know, I'm thinking about it. And then I went back to basics, you know, back to my same basics. You know, that it was really clear to me that when you're lighting the Statue of Liberty, it should not be a lighting tour de force. This was a symbol. It was not a lighting tour de force. It had to be a statement that recognized this statue. So I went back to the beginnings. I looked up all the history. I did a total historical analysis of when the statue appeared, all of the things that had occurred, all of the attempts at lighting it, and how the city grew around the statue. The statue was the tallest structure in New York when it was there, and it loomed over the harbor. Now it was diminished by the surround of the buildings. And I wanted to restore some of this sense of presence. And I wanted to make her look good. Well, one of the great advantages of that job is you had the statue there. So you had a full-size mock-up. And I would go and I would get in a boat and I'd ride around the statue. I'd drive over the bridges. I'd go over to New Jersey, look at it from there, and I'm trying to think, now what do I do? You know, meanwhile, I'm shipping boatloads of equipment out there for mock-ups. You know, that's my middle name, mock-up.
Howard Mock-up?
Yeah.
What is your middle name?
Marvin.
Marvin.
Everybody knows how I do. Everybody who's ever worked in an office understands a mock-up because they built one, at least. So I had all these lights and I was shining it on the statue, you know, from here and there and going crazy.
What kind of problems do you have?
Well, it was really clear, you know, after thinking about it for a while, that the source manufacturers do not make lights that flatter ladies with green skin. And this is a real problem. And I could see why the guys before me had such difficulty, you know, in doing this. So I'm there one morning. Just at daybreak, I went down to the dock to catch the early work boat. And the sun was coming up, and I'm looking, and it was really clear to me that this statue, which I've been looking at continuously and day and night, you know, throwing lights on it and doing this and that, looked best in the morning's light. I said, that's the most wonderful bit of imagery. Here is the lady in dawn's early light, and this statue is the symbol of the dawn of opportunity for all these immigrants who came by here. So that's what we need. And I wrote on my little index cards that I write everything on, needed. 1, invention. New lamp to simulate the morning sun. Needed. 2, new lamp to simulate the sky of the morning. Needed 3, a fixture to throw this light from the ends of the earth. And I went back, I called my friend Gil Reiling at GE, who was the inventor of the metal halide lamp, and I said, Gil, I need a metal halide lamps, 2 of them new, like this. Is this technically possible? I think it is. Why can't we make them at these correlated color temperatures? Why can't we make them, you know, with a smaller, more compact arc tube? Why can't we do all of these things? He said, we can. He said, but And I was telling him about lighting ladies for green skin. He said, do you know some other lady that's important, with green skin? And
So we're talking a real warm lamp.
one, it's not that warm,
Okay.
and one cold lamp
Okay.
that give you this sun-sky relationship to shine on the statue. And I found places at the ends of the island where we could dig pits and shine the matter at these very low angles. So it was not your typical floodlighting job. You could drive a Sherman tank into one of these pits that we dug so that nobody would even see the lights. Really marvelous contributions. There are so many, I will name a few, and I wrote them down so I wouldn't forget. I can't name them all, but I can name some. Stanley McCandless was my primary mentor. He put in writing the basic fundamentals of how we practice today. So I consider his was a really great contribution. And along with that, he supported that by being a great educator. He educated some of our most prominent professionals in architecture and in the theater who do lighting today. And I think that in that pioneering form, I paid special attention to him. Also, people who had a great influence on me were Richard Kelly and Edison Price, because they set such a high standard for design excellence that was a target. And you couldn't leave them out. Now we come to a whole host of other people. Derek Phillips, another very early professional lighting designer. Bill Richardson, Hans von Malachy, Leslie Wheel, Steve Squillaci, who I always called the Godfather. Look at the vast number of people he mentored, and brought into this business, such as David DeLaura. Consider David's contributions to lighting. You have Jonathan Spears and Mark Major, Paul Morantz, Claude Engel. And there are many other people who've had an impact on what we do. People like Louis Hartman. Louis Hartman, in case you don't know, was David Belasco's electrician, as they called him in those days, and a masterful lighting designer. John Waldron, Charles Steinmetz, Abe Fader, Hopkinson, Louis Bell wrote a first book in which lighting design was mentioned in 1902. Peter Boyce, Richard Gregory, Mark Ray, Kit Cuttle, Arthur Zionk. You could go on and on and on and on. But that's enough. There's Ed Cook of Century Lighting, who also had an impact on me. Sonny Sonnenfeld, George Eisenhower, the master of the electronic dimmer board. Chuck Levy, the Kliegel brothers. Gilbert Reiling, the inventor of the metal halide lamp. Robert Levin, the senior scientist at Sylvania. These are people who made significant contributions to light and lighting. I'm also known as an educator. I've educated hundreds and hundreds of students, and I've had a mentorship program of all the people who worked with me in the company. And I'm well recognized for making a contribution there. But I think that things that I feel proud of, it certainly is my students. They are my legacy. And it's my stance defending what I believe is what is required to be able to do my job properly. The next quantum leap in lighting is education. It will take education to make change. And education is the only philanthropy that does not impoverish the recipient. When I look into the regulations that have come down on the lighting practice. We need to lavish a little philanthropy to raise the level of knowledge about what we do. I think if we don't do that, it's a big mistake. There's a great English historian named Ernest Benn, when in 1875 said, "Politics is the art of looking for trouble, finding it whether it exists or not, diagnosing it incorrectly, and applying the wrong remedy." We need new leadership in lighting to correct this. And this will require education. We need more lighting design programs in universities around the world. We need this desperately because it's hard to find qualified people. There are too few people who recognize what an amazing contribution and what a wonderful practice lighting is. And if we don't do more to promote education, we don't do more to lure practitioners like me into the education field, we'll be making a mistake. It takes experience, it takes being out there in the world, it takes interfacing with people, it takes learning this art of communication. And if you are well educated, it's easy to do what I do every morning. I put on a cloak of humility, because if you are humble and you listen, you can learn so much, and you can provide a greater level of education to those you are interfacing with than in any other way. So I think a measure of us having achieved something in lighting is when I can go up to somebody and they ask me, "What do I do for a living?" And I tell them, "I am a lighting designer." They actually know what I do. If somebody goes and says they're an architect, they're a lawyer, they're an accountant, they're a chemist, they're a druggist, they know what they do. I say I'm a lighting designer, people look at me. And that will be my metric. When I go around and say I'm a lighting designer, that it's known what I do, we've done something. The thing that sums it up best in my mind is at a light fair in Frankfurt. I was walking around and Fred Heller was there. Fred was the former CEO of Genlight at one time. And Fred said, "Howard, it's wonderful to watch you walk through this place. You're followed by a whole array of former students." He said, "It's like the Pied Piper with this whole host of people." Here we were in Germany. There were people that I taught in Germany, England, Mexico, you name it, from all the lectures here and there. And if I am to have a legacy, my legacy is those people. Those are the ones who I hope I've given a leg up to do something that surpasses what I did.
Thank you, Howard. And it's a little difficult, commenting. And of course, we thank everybody. Right now, we have an opportunity to hear from Brooke Silber. And Brooke was one of Howard's students at RPI during the heyday of its formation and beginning and its world stature as a premier lighting center for education. So Brooke, and then we'll have a few remarks after.
Thank you, Bill. I was privileged, truly privileged, to be one of Howard's students. Howard had this way of teaching that made you feel a part of this greater community. Not only would he teach in the classroom, but the best lessons were learned when we would go out for drinks afterwards. He took us all over to the bar, and he would sit and pontificate. Howard had these axioms, these sort of guiding principles that would come up over and over again. You've heard some of them tonight in his own words. I can still hear them in my head almost day after day in his words with his certain cadence. Let's start with rules are a substitute for thinking. He really taught you to look, to see things differently, and not to be bound by what the world felt things should be. Made you think out of the box, and he would often ask you, well, if you're thinking in the box, what box are you in? Made you start to think not just about lighting, but about your own life in a whole different way. So not only was an educator of lighting, but he was an educator for you to take lessons into your personal life. Another one of his axioms was be curious, be skeptical, but keep an open mind. And I think that that's no more important then when he taught it as it is today. We have to come together and collaborate when we do our designs. It's about making sure that you can ask the important questions and learn what somebody on the other side of the table is thinking, what they have to say, and how that you can make something greater from the collective knowledge that is out there. It's believing that lighting designers and lighting scientists are friends, not enemies, and that's true of also architects and contractors and electrical engineers. He used to say to us, make sure that you get the information from the horse's mouth. He called it the horse's mouth lottery. And it was the idea that you had to go out and find the best expert that had the most information on that subject, to seek them out, to ask those important questions. And he always used to say, if you're not getting it from the horse's mouth, you're getting it from the other end of the horse. But I think the biggest lesson I learned from him, day in and day out, he would say, what is it you wish to see? Now, he was often referring to lighting design, but I realized later in life, he was talking about your own life. What is it you wish to see? If you can dream it, you can really find it, whether it's a marriage, having children, or just a career that you want to achieve and the friends and networks that you want to be a part of. Howard was about the legacy, and he mentioned it himself. Early on, he told me that when he was young, he thought of lighting things like the Statue of Liberty and these amazing towers like the Petronas Towers, that was legacy. He thought about designing for great buildings, things that would stand the test of time. He then told me that as he got older, he realized that the legacy was not about the things that you build. They will be torn down someday. But the legacy is about the people that you leave behind, and primarily the students, the lessons, the words, the inspirations that he was able to pass on. In his book, Learning to See, he says, teaching is the greatest of all design challenges. You are measured by the work of your students. And that is what legacy is, leaving on the next generation. I often share with my own students, I teach here at Parsons, and I tell them why I started teaching. They've all heard the story, I'm sure. When I graduated from RPI, from the Lighting Research Center, there was very little way to express to somebody how wonderful an education I had. It's often said that we stand on the shoulder of giants. Howard is just one of those giants, but he is a giant. So how do you thank those giants? You pay it forward. You take the lessons that you were taught and you teach your students. I now teach as my pay forward to Howard. I want to give back to the ed industry that has given me so much that he valued. And so I think it is important that we all take and pay it forward when it comes to the lessons that we've been able to learn from Howard. One of my last visits to Howard in December, just before Christmas, we discussed many things, including the importance of education. At some point he stopped and he reminded me that he was sad because he was losing some of his memories. I pointed out to him that Howard could lose more memories and knowledge of lighting and still know more than most of us will ever know in our lifetime. But I also reminded him that we, his students, his legacy, would carry on all of those memories, and therefore his memories were not lost. His memories could never be lost because we teach, we mentor, and we design with all of Howard's idioms seared into our brains. Thank you.
Brooke, we greatly appreciate your thoughts, and thank you for joining us. This effort tonight, our program that we presented, is made possible by many people. Certainly you saw the many people listed in the credits, and there are many beyond. Tonight we also want to thank Craig Berniker for hosting us here at the Parsons School, and there were a few gentlemen in back of house, so that would be Vlad and Darian, who helped us out greatly with trying to do a hybrid program, and we think that we've really tried to do justice to that as well, and we really appreciate that. You know, history is really important, and the facts are the facts, and every time you look at the facts or you look at the research, you can always uncover another perspective or another set of facts, and it's really putting things into context. And our committee tried very hard tonight, with the help of many people, to put together today's program, and we certainly hope you enjoyed it and benefited from it. We certainly would welcome your comments. We'd welcome your participation. In honor of Howard, we do have index cards, so please take a few and share your thoughts. And finally, we really do want to say that history is something that we want to preserve, we want to share with others, and we really encourage you to join us on the committee, or, you know, with the New York City section. There are many other committees, and we certainly would welcome your involvement. Right now we're going to close the program with a scrolling list of projects that Howard was involved with, and we ask the audience that is in front of us to linger for a bit and, you know, share your thoughts with the members of the committee, or, as I said, write down some thoughts or some suggestions for the committee, and we look forward to seeing you at the next IES NYC event. And Megan, did you want to say a word or two? Please.
That was just a stunning program. For those of you on Zoom, you can't participate with this, but how many here have worked with Howard, were students of Howard's? Raise your hand. And how many students are here tonight that have just learned about Howard Brandston? So, Brooke, you're paying it forward. You're doing what Howard has asked you to do. This was a terrific program. Shay, Bill, Addison, Dan, Robert Prowse. This was just awesome. Randy, this stuff wouldn't happen without you, and you know that. So thank you all very much. Let's have a chat. Let's have some memories. Please talk to Melanie, talk to the family. They'd love to hear from you. There are some amazing stories here. So thank you very much. And upstairs, there's more reception, so see you up there. Thank you.